Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this presentation entitled Let's Talk, Encouraging a Culture of Open Communication. We have two presenters today who are blessing us with their knowledge, insight, and guidance on a very sensitive topic that unimaginably impacts so many. A sincere expression of gratitude to Noreen Rahman and Chaplain Sundus Khulaki as I introduce them, inshallah. Noreen Rahman is a graduate of UCI with a bachelor's degree in comparative literature, minors in both Spanish and criminology, law and society, and a master's degree in demographics and social analysis. Noreen holds certifications in sexual assault victim advocacy, suicide intervention and prevention, domestic violence, victim advocacy, and reproductive health. She was the Girls Inc. Of Orange County, a nonprofit aimed at inspiring all girls to be strong, smart, and bold for 11 years. And she now works in business development for Natively Fluent. Chaplain Sundus Khulaki serves as a hospital staff chaplain and a community chaplain in Southern California. She's a board certified chaplain with the Association of Professional Chaplains. She earned a Master's of Divinity degree in Islamic chaplaincy from Bayan Islamic Graduate School, Claremont School of Theology, and a Bachelor's of Arts in English and Creative Writing from UCLA as a Regents Scholar. Sundus completed 5 units of clinical pastoral education residency, where she served care seekers of all faiths and educated staff and volunteers on Muslim spiritual care. She's also the author of Musings of a Muslim Chaplain and the co-editor of Mantle of Mercy, Islamic Chaplaincy in North America. She also serves as Vice President of Healthcare for the Association of Muslim Chaplains. I pass it on to both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dina. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm so glad we're here today. I'm going to share my screen with you so that see your slides. All right, we're good on this. You can see my screen. Very good. And you know what? Maybe we'll start at the first slide. I think that's the tradition of every presentation. You can get a speed presentation right here. Okay, here we go. Bismillah. So thank you so much for coming. Sundus and I are happy to be here talking about a not so very easy subject, but we're so glad we're having this conversation. I'll share a little bit more about my background in relation to working with survivors of sexual assault, child sexual abuse, and then Sundus will share a little bit more so you can kind of get a better idea of where we're coming from and what context we worked with others in this particular topic. So back in 2006, when I was at UCI, I helped restart a peer sexual assault prevention, education, and intervention program. And right after that, I graduated. I took the state certified training through what's now called Waymakers. That's basically the local rape crisis center here in Orange County. And then right after that, I joined Girls Inc. for about 11 years. And I facilitated programming for girls ages about 4.5 to 18 years old. But I mainly worked with the junior high and high school population, and specifically girls at Orange County Juvenile Hall and Youth Guidance Center, which are the 2 detention facilities for our incarcerated youth here in Orange County. I was there for about 4 weeks, 3 times a week. I would go and deliver programming. And statistically, about 80% of them are victims of child sexual abuse. So a lot of conversations, a lot of reports that I had to make in terms of child protective services. And I volunteered a little bit with the organization that trained me, Waymakers, on their hotline. And a lot of my work after transitioning out of Girls Inc. has been providing education and trainings for the general community on sexual assault, domestic violence, and suicide. So with that, I'll let Sundus add a little bit more context from her background on sexual assault.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I echo Noreen's gratitude for New Horizon for creating this space for us to begin this conversation. Just very briefly, alhamdulillah, I've been honored to accompany community members through some of their crises, among them survivors and victims of all different types of abuse, as well as family members of victims and survivors of abuse. And so I will be speaking from that context, and I'll give a little bit more in a couple of minutes, inshallah.
Okay, so let's go over a quick overview of what we're actually going to talk about today, right? We're hoping, inshallah, that this is not the first nor the last of these conversations, of these presentations. Hopefully, inshallah, once COVID's gone forever, we can be in person. We can see your beautiful faces. And the truth is, as parents, as community members, as believers, we have to address this reality, right? It's challenging, but it's so critical to have these types of sessions and conversations. So right after this overview and one more slide, Sundus will talk about what she has seen within her work on the ground. Then I'll take over and talk about understanding sexual assault. What is it exactly? How is it defined? Who does it affect? Who are the perpetrators? Some statistics. And then I'll move on to how to respond should somebody either disclose that they have been a victim of sexual assault, or how to respond preemptively with children, right? So the focus of this presentation will be for children, right? We have a lot of New Horizon parents joined here today, but it'll also cover the general adult population. Not to say that those are the only two vulnerable populations. You have a lot of other vulnerable populations, such as the elderly, people with disabilities, military, etc. So the scope of this presentation will cover child sexual abuse and sexual assault in general. But first, and then we'll have a Q&A. Hopefully, inshallah, we'll have some time for a Q&A. You're welcome to use the chat box or the Q&A section, I believe, to type in your questions. And at the very end, we'll try to answer as many questions as we can, rapid fire style. But inshallah, please be open to asking questions. Don't worry about using the right terminology or saying it a certain way. This is a safe learning space for all of us, right? We don't have these conversations often. And I don't want anyone to feel hesitant to ask a question that they might feel uncomfortable to ask because they don't know how to word it, right? Okay, so a few considerations. This will be a very open, candid conversation. So I will be using language that is pretty explicit. You don't want the little ones around for this. And reality is this topic is not the easiest to learn about or engage with. And again, the language may not be the most comfortable to hear, but please trust that it's done in the appropriate context. And please feel free to take a break. If you feel like, okay, this is a bit too much, I need to step away, please do step away, take a break, take a glass of water, walk for like a minute and come back and join us, okay? Also ask questions, said that. And last thing, keep on learning. This within the hour or so, some of this are barely scratching the surface on this particular topic, right? We could have sessions on so many subtopics for hours. So please keep on learning. At the end of this presentation, we'll have a slide with a ton of resources. I encourage you to go to those resources. Click on the tabs of how to support a survivor, learning more about sexual assault. How can I volunteer? How can I get involved? How can I donate, right? So I will remind you at the end again, but we encourage you to just screenshot that last slide of resources just so you have it at the ready. Okay, I will leave it to you, Sundus. Stop sharing. You can share your screen. And we'll just,
my turn.
Yeah.
Let's do it. Bismillah. Okay, how was that?
Great.
Great. Okay. All right. Bismillah. Deep breath. So as I was saying before, I've had the incredible honor to accompany community members, Muslim community members during my chaplaincy office hours for, gosh, has it been a little over 2 years now or 2 years? So I have found myself supporting victims of abuse as well as family members of those victims or good friends, supporters in some way. And the reason that they reach out to me primarily is not only for a little bit of talk therapy and help to be connected to resources, but also for them to gain clarity on the use of religion. Because what they find when they disclose to somebody who's close to them about something that happened to them recently or maybe in childhood is that the response will be something along the lines where it's using religion to silence them or to justify the abuse that happened to them or justify the person who harmed. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is that this creates an additional burden, additional layer of abuse called spiritual abuse, where the victims are stripped of their rights, their agency, and their safety through the misuse of religious references. So at a time when survivors and victims should be leaning into their religion, into the faith tradition, into these principles and practices for their healing journey, it's used to silence them or to shame them. And this is incredibly detrimental, and it's heartbreaking to be on the receiving end of that. So for the sake of our collective learning, what I've done is I've tried to compile and summarize kind of the top responses that I've been hearing from survivors and their reporters by probably well-meaning and well-intentioned family members, friends, and community members who are most likely speaking more out of their discomfort of the subject rather than religious knowledge. So one of the first statements that I'll offer here is being told for a survivor or a friend of a survivor being told, just forgive them, forgive the person who harmed you. It was a long time ago, or, add whatever justification you want to the end of that. And as we know, as human beings, in whatever situation we have found ourselves in, when we are hurt by somebody badly, forgiveness is a very complex offering. It takes a lot of inner work to reach a place where you can release abuse and injustice. And we know that from this, one of the stories from Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, where he tells his companions about a man who earns his entrance into Jannah solely because of the fact that he spends every night before he goes to bed releasing his heart of those who have transgressed boundaries of him that day, and gives them complete forgiveness. So this connection between gaining Jannah from this small act tells us that it's actually not quite small at all, that it's a lot of hard work. And we should also understand that when there's an absence of healing, there is a void there when it comes to forgiveness. It's really, really difficult to reach a place of forgiveness when that wound isn't healed. So very similar to grief, reaching forgiveness is a process, and it looks different for everybody. And I'll close on this particular statement with also the story from the Sirah of the Prophet ﷺ and his experience with Wahshi. Wahshi was the man who murdered and mutilated the Prophet ﷺ's uncle Hamza in battle. And that was extremely traumatizing for our Prophet ﷺ. And many years later, after the conquest of Mecca, when Wahshi accepted Islam, he came to the Prophet ﷺ and he gave his shahada, and the Prophet ﷺ, of course, didn't turn him away, didn't tell him, you can't be Muslim. But he did, interestingly, set up boundaries around him. He made sure that Wahshi was the one who murdered his uncle. And when he confirmed that, he told Wahshi, your conversion obviously is accepted, but please don't be around me. In other words, you're not going to be in my inner circle. And I think that it's very telling that, our beloved Prophet ﷺ, the one who's mercy to all of mankind, was still so hurt by this person and their actions that he set up some safe boundaries for himself. And we can definitely learn from his example, and we do learn from his example. Another statement that I've heard from survivors and supporters of survivors are told, we can't just cut off this person who harmed, whether they be family member, community member, or friend, their family, or interject whatever role that they have in closeness. So one of the essential Islamic legal maxims is that harm must be removed. And there's in fact priority given to victims of harm and injustice and oppression. So the priority is not, in this case, preserving family relations when there's harm occurring. So if we are rewarded by Allah Ta'ala for removing an obstacle from the road, imagine the rewards that, or imagine the imperative rather, to remove obstacles for a victim. And in fact, there's a science to this. At the very minimum, in order to begin the healing process, victims first and foremost need to feel safe. And it's incredibly difficult for a victim or person who's been harmed to feel safe when that person is in their vicinity, in their physical presence, even in their mental space. They're going to be stuck in crisis mode, mentally and physically, and you can't help it. This is biological response, subhanAllah. So there is an imperative there to remove harm. Something else that we might hear, or that I have heard others tell me, is that they're told, let's not speak of this again. Let's not talk about it. Something like, it will ruin your reputation. Don't tell anybody. And for this, I was reminded of a beautiful talk that was given by Imam Omar Suleiman, who was reflecting on Surah Al-Mujadala in the Quran, where there was a woman named Khawla who came to our beloved Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and she was complaining about the abuse the verbal abuse that she was experiencing at the hands of her husband. And what's really beautiful about this surah is that Allah Ta'ala could have chosen to reveal to the Prophet ﷺ how to advise Khawla and how to deal with her situation. But instead, he made it an entire chapter of the Quran for everybody to listen to recite, and to learn from for generations from then until the Day of Judgment. And for me, this is very telling. We need to talk about this with our children, with our families, with our friends in our community. It takes so much courage for somebody to disclose to somebody else about abuse and their abuser, especially considering the stigma that's attached to intimacy before or outside of marriage. And so the fact that somebody is trusting us enough with that disclosure and to give them this in response is devastating. Something else that I've heard from others is along these lines, don't tell anybody else, it will bring fitna to the community. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ did say, there is a hadith where he says, ﷺ, whoever covers the flaws of a Muslim in this world, Allah will cover his or her flaws on the Day of Judgment. And the misunderstanding of this hadith is, and others of its variation, others that are similar to it, is people misunderstand it to mean that covering Muslims' flaws and shortcomings is unconditional, that this is an unconditional duty, and that is in fact incorrect. And that scholars and our jurists have put very specific conditions to this concept of sitr, of covering up somebody else's flaws. It is not an unconditional pass, especially given to repeat offenders who persist in their offenses and whose actions affect others and violate their rights. It's something to say where you're sinning and you're affecting your own soul, you're harming your own soul. Well, when it comes to the rights of others, then there's something needs to be done. If other people's rights are involved, then sitr cannot be invoked. And then lastly, to hear people just incredulous and say, but they're such a good person. As human beings, we are capable of making good choices and we're capable of making not so good choices. We know from the Quran and from the Sirah that hypocrites do exist, and we can't tell the hypocrite from the believer just by what that person presents outwardly. By saying something like, but they're such a good person, or they're so religious, we're sending the wrong message, especially to our children who are a trust, who are amana from Allah to us. Because we need to teach our children that trust is not just freely given, it is earned. Even if somebody appears religious, we never leave our child alone with them. We never take for granted that that person is going to be trustworthy and safe for them. We are told to trust only Allah fully. And we know that in the Quran, Allah Ta'ala tells us to form contracts between one another when we're trying to put together agreements, because He knows that as much as we want to be trustworthy, or we're trustworthy perhaps in any other situation, that shaitan is tempting us to go astray. And so there's that importance there. And I'd like to conclude just my portion with a message to survivors that may be listening, that Allah is the all-seeing, that He is the all-knowing, and He is the most just, that there is absolutely nothing that is missed or hidden when it comes to Allah Ta'ala. And so rest assured that His justice is perfect and His timing is perfect. And even if you feel that you're not receiving the justice that you deserve in this life, know with absolute certainty that His justice will prevail, inshallah. So I will stop sharing here and turn it over back to Noreen.
Okay. Lovely here. All right. Thank you, Sundas. Thank you for setting that up so beautifully. Okay. No, you think I would learn I'd be ready at the right slide. Okay. So like I said earlier, we are going to talk about child sexual abuse, but we're also going to touch upon sexual assault when the victim survivors are adults as well. So what is sexual assault? Okay. It's basically a broad definition is sexual contact or behavior without consent. Okay. Consent is a huge determining factor. So what can nullify consent? That could be, for example, intoxication, lack of consciousness, any mental or physical disability, right? If there is no consent, that falls within the realms of sexual assault. Sometimes there's also force. And typically we might think, oh, force means just physical force. No, it's not just physical violence. It could also be coercion or threats or manipulation. For children, this might be like if you tell your mom or dad, I'm going to hurt them. For adults, it can look very different. I'm going to hurt the children, right? So force doesn't always have to be physical violence. Rape is actually a form of sexual assault. So sexual assault is an umbrella term and rape is a specific form of sexual assault. And I'll read the definition just so we're a little bit more clear. It's by the FBI Unified Crime Reports. It's basically penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim, right? So again, consent is the key issue. Sexual harassment is actually a little bit different. It can include sexual assault, but I want to make sure sometimes people get confused of, okay, so what's sexual harassment versus what's sexual assault? And that's defined by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission as unwelcome sexual advances, requests, or other verbal, physical harassment of a sexual nature in the workplace or learning environment, or even within a faith-based institution. That's my piece that I added. And it includes a power dynamic, right? And you see that definitely with youth as well. Okay, so let's go on to what else sexual assault can include. There's acquaintance rape, and that's basically where the perpetrator is known to the victim. Child sexual abuse, which we'll get into a little bit more detail. Marital, dating, partner rape. Sometimes we don't like to imagine that even within the sanctity of marriage, that sexual assault can occur, but it does. Hate crime, stranger rape, this is where the perpetrator is not known to the victim at all, or incest. Okay. So what is child sexual abuse? That's basically any sexual activity with a minor. And it's important to understand that the abuse can include non-direct physical actions too. For example, obscene phone calls, messages, digital interactions, social media, any of that. Exhibitionism, or exposing oneself to a minor. Producing, owning, sharing pornographic images or movies to children. And then the more physical ones, fondling, masturbation in the presence of a minor or forcing a minor to masturbate, sex of any kind with a minor, including vaginal, oral, or anal, sex trafficking, any other sexual conduct that is harmful to a child's mental, emotional, or physical welfare, right? Okay, I talk a mile a minute, so shout out in the chat box, slow down, and I will. But alhamdulillah, there's a lot to cover and I wanna make sure we cover it. And inshallah, we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So let's talk a little bit about statistics, okay? I can go down a rabbit hole of statistics, but the main ones that I'll focus on are how often, who are the victims and the effects of child sexual abuse, right? So the first one, before I share it, we'll try to get a little engaging here. If you want, you can share your answer in the chat box. But the first one is about child sexual abuse and how often it occurs, right? So I'll give you a multiple choice. Is it every 5 minutes, 9 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes? I made it a little bit easy for you. 9 was the only variable. It's every 9 minutes. And subhanAllah, that goes to tell you that by the time this presentation is over, right? At about 6 children will have experienced child sexual abuse. And think about the statistic for a second. It's not every 9 minutes someone is suspected of child sexual abuse. It's not every 9 minutes that someone is accused of child sexual abuse. This statistics represents every 9 minutes Child Protective Services substantiates evidence, finds evidence of child sexual abuse, right? And personally, having made so many reports to Child Protective Services and getting that letter back saying, oh, report was unconfirmed, et cetera, et cetera. They don't give you a lot of details, but I usually know like, okay, the case was solved, it was closed, whatever. I don't have the nitty-gritty details, but every 9 minutes they find something that proves, yes, child sexual abuse does occur. So a lot of times, not just the Muslim community, we have this mentality that it doesn't occur, it doesn't happen. Islam has protective parameters in place to prevent this from happening. But the Muslim community is not immune to this, right? And to think about, of all the child sexual abuses cases that I've had, or even just the last 5 that people have disclosed to me as adults, none of those were ever reported, right? So underreporting is a huge, huge issue when it comes to sexual assault for children, for adults, for men, for various reasons. Okay, next statistic, every 68 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted. By the time this presentation is over, that's 53 Americans who will be sexually assaulted by the time we're done talking. Every 68 seconds, that's 53 Americans, 53 people living here. The age of children, right? If you look at it, it might be hard to see, hope you can see it. The majority, 66%, are between the ages of 12 and 17, but then about 34% are under the age of 12, right? Think about that for a minute. Under the age of 12, most of those children have not even hit puberty yet. And keep this statistic in mind when we're talking about why sexual assault happens. 1 in 4 girls will be sexually abused before they even turn 18, right? That's alarmingly high. Think of 4 girls that you know. 1 in 6 women will be victims of attempted or completed rape, right? And we defined what rape was. 1 in 6 boys will be sexually abused before they even turn 18 years old. And 1 in 33 men. But you also have to realize underreporting is huge, especially for men. And you have to ask yourself, well, why is that? Well, let's think about the general narrative that we have regarding masculinity, sexuality, or what about when the perpetrator is a female? And oftentimes, society at large excuses the perpetrator for sexual assault because of, oh, it's uncontrollable sexual urges. But what about when the victim's a male? How does that logic play out? So we haven't exactly created a safe environment for males to come forward and disclose sexual assault. Let's take a quick look at the effects of sexual assault. Okay. I want to make sure we had a comment in the chat. I'm not missing anything. Children who experience sexual abuse are 4 times more likely to engage in drug abuse or abuse drugs or have PTSD, 3 times more likely to have depression as adults. For adult women, rape and suicide are also linked. 33% of women contemplate suicide and 13% of women actually attempt suicide. And towards the end, at the last slide, when we have resources, there is a resource for suicide as well. They have a hotline as well to ask questions. So the next statistic I'm going to share with you is how often, what percentage of the perpetrators are known to the child. So what percentage are child sexual abusers known to the victim? Okay, I won't use a chat box, it'll get too messy, but think about it. How many of them actually know the person who is harming them? It's 93%. About 9 out of 10 times, it's somebody that they know. 1 in 3 are actually family members. We don't like to think that our own family is capable of doing something that harms our child, but that can negatively translate into denial during disclosure, not believing the child, or just not wanting to come to grips with reality of what actually happened. Right, like Sundus had mentioned, sweeping it under the rug, not creating fitna. Few more. 80% of the perpetrators are known to the adult victims. Think about spouses, think about other people within their lives. And again, we don't like to think about it within marriage, but a marriage contract does not mean consent 100% of the time, right? Consent has to exist in every single type of relationship, including marriage. 88% of the time, child sexual abusers are male, but they're not always, right? And underreporting is also pretty high. So that's the end of the statistics portion. I'm going to move on to some of the warning signs and red flags for both children and adults. I've broken them up into behavioral and physical issues, physical characteristics. So if you look at the behavioral, for children, that can look like regressive behavior. So what is that? That could be like bedwetting. It could be like thumb sucking, right? Regressive behavior developmentally. Change in hygiene habits, that could be excessive bathing or not bathing at all. I remember in particular at juvenile hall, there was one girl. Well, all the girls said, I don't want to sit next to her. I don't want to sit next to her. I said, why? She smells. She doesn't shower. And I remember specifically her writing would be so tiny where you could barely see it. SubhanAllah, as if she wanted to just disappear. And juvenile hall is a whole other set of trauma, if you will. But change in hygiene habits is one thing that's kind of like a red flag. Sleep disturbances, not being able to sleep well, waking up throughout the night continuously, or they're threatened by physical contact, right? Someone goes in for a hug and they're a little alarmed, a little jolted. Or having age-inappropriate sexual knowledge or age-inappropriate sexual behavior, right? Talking about things that a typical 12-year-old or 10-year-old or 5-year-old shouldn't really know about. Sudden reticence. They used to be talkative and not so much anymore. Some of this, as children mature, can delve into what adult behavior might look like post sexual assault. Self-blame is a huge issue with survivors. It's something that is felt very strongly. And a lot of it can translate into, well, why did I do this? I shouldn't have said this. I shouldn't have been here, right? Thinking of all the ways that the survivor supposedly encouraged the perpetrator, gave them the impression that they were consenting. So self-blame is huge. And lots of feelings all across the spectrum that can run from anxiety to shock to anger, sadness, fear, betrayal, a loss of trust, a general loss of trust in just people, and feeling excessively vulnerable, just vulnerable with people who they may not have normally felt vulnerable with. PTSD, depression, which can lead to suicide or suicide ideation as well. So what about some physical? For children, it's a little bit more obvious that bruising, swelling, bleeding by genital area, or blood-stained undergarments or bed sheets. And some of the physical signs for adults could be eating disorders or self-harm. Self-harm is cutting, burning, and sometimes those are even coping mechanisms to deal with the trauma. Okay, so now we're going to transition into the why behind sexual assault a little bit. It's about power and control. SubhanAllah, it's very sad to hear that people still sometimes think about, oh, it's just, you know, people have these sexual needs and they need to fulfill these needs, etc. But it's not. Numerous studies have indicated sexual assault is about power and control, as plain as that. It's very easy for us to think, oh, this is why, rather than realizing that another human being could possibly want to have power and control over someone and cause trauma and harm. It's not because lack of hijab or modest clothing. Unfortunately, that is something that Muslims and other faith institutions that have more modest dress believe in sometimes, and it's very, very harmful to survivors. Because think about it, what about children's clothing, right? Think about what a 6-year-old girl wears or a 10-year-old boy wears. Is that sexually suggestive? Or what about women who do wear hijab or an abaya and niqab, right? It's very harmful to think that, you know what, if women just covered up, this wouldn't happen. And this is why women are supposed to cover. It's not. I'm no sheikh, and I won't go into the scholarly opinion, but the scholars that I have talked to, and I said, listen, where does it say that, cover themselves so they will not be assaulted? And it's not. The meaning is completely different from how people want to interpret it. And who knows why, but one of the various reasons I think might be because it's a false sense of security. Okay, if I just do X, Y, and Z, this won't happen to me, this won't happen to my children, and I'm safe, right? Not wanting to come to the reality that people do perpetrate against children, against women, against boys, against men. Children are vulnerable and accessible, dealing with specifically child sexual abuse, right? Think about the family members who have access to children, think about teachers, coaches, religious leaders, etc. And especially, yes, in case the perpetrator is a family member. Okay, so let's transition now on how to respond. The how to respond part will be broken up into about 2 parts, right? So the first will be how to preemptively talk to your child about this topic, while the second part is how do you respond in case someone discloses to you that they have been a victim of sexual assault, okay? For the preemptive portion, a lot of resources will list this under how to protect your kids. And I'm a little wary of using the word how to protect the kids or that phrase, because I say protect with caution because an occurrence of child sexual abuse doesn't mean that a parent did not protect their child, right? As parents, we can do everything right and still children are sexually abused, right? The only surefire 100% way to prevent child abuse is for abusers to stop abusing, right? So we have to realize that, yes, let's put these protective factors and mechanisms in place to reduce the risk of child sexual abuse, but the fault and guilt and culpability does not lie on the parent or the child for doing X, Y, and Z or the adult. It's because the perpetrator perpetrated, right? So let's focus on that for a minute. How to respond preemptively. One is talk to them, okay? Have an open line of communication and let them know that they won't get in trouble. Because sometimes the children may have been engaging in behavior that you may not approve of, right? Like drinking or going to a party or whatever it may be. Ultimately, it doesn't matter what you're doing. It doesn't matter who you're with. It doesn't matter if you're drinking. It doesn't matter where you were. No one has that right to take advantage of anybody. One thing that you could do for children is have a culture of no secrets in your home, right? Because oftentimes the perpetrator will convince, coerce, and threaten the child to secrecy to avoid being discovered. So make it a rule, you know what? In this house, we don't have secrets. We can have happy surprises, but no secrets for mom or dad, and get them used to the idea of not having secrets. Because if someone does ask them to keep a secret, they understand that, wait, this is different. I was told not to keep secrets. It raises a red flag for them. It teaches them to be a little vigilant, right? Have a safety network, okay? That's important in the sense that you need to know, one, who are the children in their lives? Who are their teachers? Who are the people around the periphery outside of the immediate family? But together with your child, create a list of safe adults, 3 to 4, safe adults that the child can talk to should the need arise, should they feel scared, uncomfortable, something happens, right? Have them write down their names, have them write down their phone numbers, and keep it somewhere safe that's accessible to them. Make sure you're using language that's clear to children, right? And this can vary developmentally for the different ages. A lot of parenting advice is to use appropriate scientific name for genitalia, for example. And I know this may be unconventional, maybe a little uncomfortable for families, but in the context of creating protective factors against child sexual abuse, this is important, right? Because some families use private parts for genitalia, which is understandable. But a lot of professionals advocate for using penis and vagina, right? For many reasons. Using silly words like pee-pee, for example, for genitalia can make the child feel a little silly talking about these and also confuse them into thinking that, you know what, there's something shameful and embarrassing about them, about these body parts of theirs, right? Now, please don't be confused with modesty. Modesty is very different from shame, right? There can be beauty in modesty, right? Teaching them modesty should be done without making them feel embarrassed or ashamed of their bodies. Then ask questions, right? Oftentimes at an event, and I'm totally guilty of this too, they go to an event, a birthday party, a celebration, an outing, and we ask that one common question: did you have fun, right? The answer is typically yes, but you don't really get much more out of that question. And especially if you ask in front of the host, right? In front of the person's house that they went to, for example. Sure, ask if they had fun, what did they enjoy, etc. But also lead up to questions like, did anyone make you feel scared, uncomfortable? Did you feel safe, right? Ask those probing questions so that you do have you give the child an opportunity to divulge anything that may have occurred that can't be answered outside of the question of, did you have fun, right? Because you have to realize children won't typically just offer up information directly. Asking them, for example, if someone's hurting them might be unclear, right? Because if it's a family members, they're not thought of someone who's supposed to hurt them, right? And what if their bodies didn't physically hurt? What if their body responded physiologically positively, right, during the abuse? It's very confusing. So one story that I'll share is, I remember being in the 8th grade, sitting in front of a friend in English class, and he casually stated, oh yeah, I've had sex before. Not really? He's like, yeah. And he went on to share how he was raped by an older female neighbor, right? In his eyes, that was sex, right? As an 8th grader, even then, 1997, 8, no one had talked to us about this is consent. This is considered a healthy relationship. This is considered sexual assault. No one had talked to us about that in the schools, nobody, not the parents either. I remember another time when I was working on the hotline, a caller had called and he had stated very clearly that he had been raped by another man. And he was so confused. Okay, you guys, this is an adult male. He was so confused because he said, well, I had an erection. So was it rape? I enjoyed it. I had an erection, didn't I? And he was confused about his sexual orientation too. Well, does this make me gay if I had an erection during the assault? So realize that, yes, it was rape, and yes, his body responded the way it responded, but that doesn't mean it wasn't consensual or that it was consensual. Talk to your children about consent and boundaries, right? No means no. When someone says stop, you stop. Have that as another motto in your family, even in play fighting or tickling. When someone says stop, you stop, right? Because it gets them accustomed to and reinforces the idea that if someone doesn't stop when they ask them to stop, it's a red flag, right? And what that other person is doing is not okay, right? Because it's unclear whether or not that sexual abuse of a child is wrong or harmful, abusive to them in that moment. And again, sometimes they might even feel good. And remember, if that person is known to them, right? It's not a complete stranger who they're easily able to disassociate and say, you're not somebody I'm comfortable with, right? Especially family members. So another thing to think about is that they may have even been groomed to think that this behavior is okay and normal and acceptable, right? And grooming is basically a set of behaviors that are manipulative behaviors that used by the perpetrator to reduce the risk of getting caught and to coerce the child into thinking that this is normal, right? In a lot of cases that the child does not realize that what's happening is not harmful or it's not normal. Teach them about boundaries. One prime example is not forcing them to hug or kiss a relative, right? That's teaching them that they have authority over their bodies and people have to respect their boundaries, whether it's a simple hug, right? And another simple way for children to realize, okay, what are my boundaries? What are my body boundaries? What areas are off limits, okay? It's using the bathing suit reference. All parts that a bathing suit covers is considered private and off limits. Having some visuals like that helps children understand a little bit better too. And then lastly, talk to them about healthy relationships. As children get older, it's important to let them know what constitutes as healthy versus unhealthy relationships, right? And I know sometimes my friends and I will gripe and say that, gosh, as Muslim, our parents say, don't talk to, people of the opposite gender and don't engage in romantic relationships, et cetera, et cetera. And by the time you're of age to get married, it's like, oh, well, did you find anybody? Are you talking to anybody? There isn't that balance, that moderation in between. And we don't know sometimes as Muslims of what's healthy, what's unhealthy, right? That gauge is very hard to determine sometimes. So it doesn't always have to apply to romantic relationships, right? Teach them about red flags in any type of relationships, right? It can be controlling behavior, jealousy, threats, texting to find out where are you, who are you going with, trying to isolate that person. Okay, so let's move on to how are we doing in the chat box in this? Are we good? Okay, no questions, no comments. Great. Everyone's asleep. That's the thing about Zoom. You can't tell, like, is everyone okay? Are they listening? Did my jokes just fall totally flat? Okay, let's go on. Upon disclosure, listen. And this sometimes may be one of the hardest things, right? When I would do the trainings in person, I would actually have person A share a story for 2 minutes, and person B had to be completely tight-lipped, nothing. And afterwards, people are like, this was so hard. I want to say, oh yeah, that happened to me too. Oh my gosh, I totally understand. Sometimes you just need to be quiet and listen, right? When it comes to something as heavy as sexual assault, especially of a child or someone you care for, a loved one, it's going to be very hard sometimes to avoid making judgments or controlling those feelings, right? So the little thing about judgments, self-blame is huge for survivors, especially if they made choices that you might disagree with, right? Managing emotions, maybe also something that's really hard to do, the anger, the horror, regardless if yes, what happened to this person is horrific and they shouldn't have gone through this person should not have done that. It's important to keep calm and keep that in check, right? Because what happens sometimes is when people's emotions take over, then the issue becomes about them rather than focusing on the survivor and what their emotional needs are at that moment, right? Again, for children, they may already be afraid of disclosing because they think the parent's going to get mad because of where they were, what they did, but just mad that this happened. And kids internalize that. Sometimes they think, oh, they're mad at me because I let this happen, or they're just mad that this happened. And then the focus again shifts to them. You don't want them to feel responsible, children or adults, for your feelings, right? Because then that just creates another layer that doesn't need to be there for them. And oftentimes it might be even hard for them to vilify the perpetrator because remember, 8 or 9 times out of 10, the perpetrator is someone that they know, right? It's a family, a friend, a neighbor, a community member, a leader. Also, what you could do is summarize what you heard, relay it back to them. So what I'm hearing is, when I'm seeing what your feeling is, right? Validate their feelings. My next point. It sounds like you're feeling X, Y, and Z. Feelings can run all across the spectrum after child sexual abuse and sexual assault, and that's normal, right? There's no one certain way to feel, right? Don't be tricked by what Hollywood shows or what people expect. It's a very diverse spectrum, and leave space for that, for people to feel what they need to feel. Be patient. There may be some silences. Make space for that. Make space for that silence. It's okay. Being there with them, believing them, right? First and foremost, being there with them, believing them, and letting them know that you are there to support them, and silence is okay. I remember when I was taking my training back in 2006, and the trainer said, okay, let's think about this for a minute. If I were to tell you, turn to the person on your right and share with them in detail your last sexual experience. All of us were like, oh, what? Right? And she said, this is what we're asking survivors to do sometimes. Share with us in details, and especially when it comes to reporting, share with us what happened, right? And she was asking us to share an experience that was consensual. What about when it's non-consensual? And what about somebody who completely betrayed their trust, right? Ask questions in time, but take it slow. With children, you can ask questions, the questions that are encouraged to ask within time and, at the pace that is appropriate is what happened? When did it happen? Where did it happen? Who did it, right? But obviously, trust your instincts, take that part slow, right? And then also avoid why questions. Why questions, because that implies guilt. Why did you go there? Why were you drinking? Because in their mind, it could be, yeah, you're right, I shouldn't have gone there. Yeah, you're right, I shouldn't have been drinking, right? Lastly, reporting. For children, this means either calling law enforcement, or if someone's in immediate danger, calling 911. It can also mean calling Child Protective Services and making a report, who will then contact law enforcement based on the information that you give them. I highly encourage you to report. In many states, the parents can be held liable if they know that abuse is occurring and they neglected to stop it, to do something to stop it, right? It's not the easiest thing to do, understandably, if that person, the perpetrator, is known to the victim. But you have to think it can help with healing sometimes, and that depends on the survivor. People feel differently about why they report, but you also have to think, is this perpetrator around other minors, right? Could there potentially be other victims at the hands of this particular perpetrator? So let's talk a little bit about reporting for adults for a second, because there's a little bit of a shift, okay? Because adults, there's no issue of being a mandated reporter, right? So for example, when I was volunteering with the masjid or working at Girls Inc., I was a mandated reporter, and I would have to report it, regardless if it happened 10 years ago, regardless if it happened just the day before. No matter how much time has passed, I would have to report it, okay? For an adult, that's not necessarily the case. And what's really important is that, remember, in sexual assault, power and control has been taken away from that survivor in those moments, right? So it's critical as a supporter to not indirectly do the same. By that, I mean, give them options. Even though you may think, you know what, we need to march down to the police station and report this person right away, or let's pick up the phone and call the sheriff's department. That's their choice to make, right? And your role is not to play savior, right? You don't have to be their white knight, because they have to be okay with the choices. So your role is to provide them support, resources, and options, okay? They need to be the ones making that decision, because like I said before, when that report is made, they have to share with, inshallah, hopefully trained law enforcement who know how to work with survivors of sexual assault. They have to share with them in detail what happened, right? And they may have to go through a rape kit, right? Which is the forensic medical exam that can happen if the assault occurred within a recent time period. And honestly, telling this story over and over again can be traumatizing in and of itself, right? But obviously there's a lot of benefit in reporting. It just depends on how that survivor feels about reporting at that time as well. One story that I will share, working with youth. So I've had to make unfortunately, lots of Child Protective Services reports. And one in particular that I will never forget is of a high schooler. She had written an essay, in her scholarship essay, her sexual assault story, and she submitted it to the organization. And we always tell the students that, listen, we're mandated reporters, telling that from the get-go. So anything you say, if someone's hurting you or in the future, all of that, we have to share that for your safety and protection. So we tell them that, but sometimes they forget, right? So once my colleagues and I came across her essay, we realized, okay, we need to talk to her. We need to report this. So we go down to the high school the very next day. It's the first class. So early morning, first period of the day, we pull her out of class and we're sitting in the empty classroom where this after school program typically takes place. And we share with her that, listen, we need to share this information with Child Protective Services. And we explained to her the how, the why, the reasonings of having to make this report. I kid you not, for the next 7 to 10 minutes, this girl pleads and sobs and begs for us not to make that phone call. Okay, she says, please don't do that. And her main concern was that she didn't want to add one more thing to her parents' plate. She didn't want them to have to worry about one more thing. SubhanAllah. Still, we had to file the report, but we gave her options. We said, listen, you can stay in the room while we make that call. You can talk to the person on the other line, the representative, you can talk to them, share anything you want to share, answer questions that you want to share. So she chose to stay in the room. She chose to talk to the person on the other line. Fast forward 6 months, she writes another scholarship essay where she states that telling was one of the best things she had done. SubhanAllah. Inshallah, make every sharing of every trauma be just as healing for everyone. That is my dua. Okay, so what else can you do? Getting towards the tail end of our presentation. One, you can better your relationship with your child, right? And know that responding and learning about sexual assault, like I said, it extends far beyond this one presentation. That's 50 minutes, 60 minutes, right? There's a lot more that you can do to learn, but also to work with survivors and preemptively with your child. So better your relationship with your child, right? One way you can do this is practice positive discipline. So I was really thrilled to hear that New Horizon is a positive discipline school, and Dina's really making me rethink homeschooling my child and not just sending her off to New Horizon. But what I love about positive discipline is that it disciplines without having the shame, right? It disciplines while still validating feelings and acknowledging and respecting your child, right? That goes a very long way in terms of building up that social capital, that emotional capital, if you will, should they have something to tell you, such as sexual assault, sexual abuse, right? A really great book that you can check out is Positive Discipline in the Muslim Home. And I think I saw Manira's name here. It's by Manira Ezeldine and Nahal Shagari. They are amazing. If you get a chance to sit in on Noha's trainings in positive discipline, I highly encourage it. It's life-changing, honestly. And I'll share with you, I actually came across positive discipline through another book called, I think it's How to Talk to Kids So They'll Listen, How to Listen So Kids Will Talk. And I remember when I read it when I had my daughter, she was like 2.5 years old. And I tried out the first technique. I was sitting there, it's close to bedtime. She's brushing her teeth with dad and all that. And I'm sitting there, I'm eating my cookie alone in the kitchen. Here she comes in and she sees me and she says, Mama, I want a cookie. And I'm thinking, oh my God, bedtime just got delayed by half an hour. And it's about to go down. This is World War III right here. And I kid you not, I used the tactics. The kid looked at me and said, okay, Mama. And she walked off. So I'm sitting there dumbfounded with cookie crumbs all over my face. What just happened? This is really work? Apparently it did. SubhanAllah, I really encourage you to check it out. Another thing you can do is, create an emotionally safe environment for conversation, for emotions, right? Think about when you hear so-and-so imam was accused of X, Y, and Z, or so-and-so Muslim leader is accused of X, Y, and Z. What are you saying? What is your response, right? What messages are you sending to your children about being believed and who is or is not capable of such things, right? What about with emotions? How are you telling them indirectly or directly about how to handle tough emotions such as sadness, anger, or fear? Do the boys in the house feel like it's okay to cry? Have they seen their parent cry? How is anger expressed in the home? Healing. Sunda's touched upon this a little bit. A lot of times it really does help to talk to a professional, whether to be share our own trauma, our marriage, our parenting difficulties, talking to someone who has spent years, right, educating themselves on how to better human relationships can have a profound impact. And I have permission to share this, but I've gone to both individual therapy and marital therapy. And subhanAllah, it is astounding what you can learn and realize what you don't know that you don't know about yourself or your partner, your spouse, right? So my husband and I are huge advocates of therapy, and I really encourage people to try it out. And there's some resources that can that can create some opportunities of where to seek therapy. Learn more about sexual assault and supporting survivors, right? I'm so glad that everyone is here tonight, but continue supporting organizations that are having these conversations, that are having these trainings, et cetera, events. And another thing that I can say is push for accountability. This one can be a hard one, right? Especially for our community. I feel like we really falter sometimes when things go awry, right? But it's really important to hold institutions and leaders accountable. And that can be actions that are really big and really small, right? But it's important to do something to let them know like, hey, this isn't okay, right? This is what you could do better if you have the tools to do that. And at least letting them know that this was not okay. Something needs to happen when people are held accountable. Lastly, speak up. I think we live in a very broader culture that can trivialize sexual assaults in general. And the impact of that can be so tremendous on someone coming forward or not and disclosing or not, right? If you think about it, statistically, you already know someone who has been directly impacted by child sexual abuse or sexual assault. So make sure you're creating a safe space for them to come forward. Okay, as promised, resources. That was a lot. Okay. Sexual assault resources, just a few of them. There's other orgs that are doing amazing stuff, but this is just some of them. I encourage you to take a screenshot of this right now. I will talk a little bit about them very briefly, but RAIN is a really great organization. It's the largest organization in the nation. RAIN stands for Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. They actually have an anonymous hotline that's for everyone, for victims, for parents, anybody, supporters. I actually tested it out because it's been a while since I had called a hotline or them. And I asked them a basic question of, hey, you know, do parents have to report child sexual abuse? And no, in the state of California, parents are not mandated reporters. But again, they can be held liable if they know and they do not do anything to protect the child. But it's so interesting because I actually talked to somebody at RAIN, and she was a VP of communications, I believe. And she had said that they have created their own hotline technology to make it so anonymous where they don't even know the IP addresses, right? And other rape crisis centers actually adopt their technology. So the information you give them in terms of where you're calling from, any of that is even blinded to them. So if you're even feeling a little on the fence of, I don't know if this constitutes a sexual assault, I don't know if what happened to my child fits this category or what happened to me, it's okay to just call them. And on the other line, you're going to find someone who's gone through cultural sensitivity trainings, which brings me to Wavemakers. They're actually the ones who trained me. They're based here in Orange County. They also have an anonymous hotline for sexual assault. And I actually even trained their volunteers a few years back on how to work with Muslim survivors. So the staff there are really amazing and very intentional on how to work with survivors who are Muslim without unintentionally creating more harm. Heart Women Girls has a lot of information on sexual assault and information on the Muslim community in and of itself. One great organization for Muslim support services is Khalil Center, right? And they're based here locally in Orange County too. And then lastly is Didi Hirsch. They are, they have a small office in Orange County, mainly based in LA, but they focus on suicide, right? Because that's also something that we don't really talk about much. And there's a stigma attached to it in terms of what it means if someone dies by suicide. So I encourage you to check out their website. A lot of these organizations have tabs on what is sexual violence, what is suicide, how can you help someone who's feeling depressed, who you think might be considering suicide, etc. Okay, that's all we have. That was a lot, Sundus. Alhamdulillah. And we're at 8:30.
Allah, Noreen. You got this, girl. We have one question in. So just for the sake of time, let's just get to that one. I don't see any others. But says, I may have missed this, but I heard it's beneficial to have other designated safe people that your kid can go to if they aren't able to come to you. What are your thoughts about that?
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, we did cover that. It's 3 to 4 people who are considered safe adults within your child's life. So who might that look like? So when I did this activity with my child, I asked her, who do you feel would be safe? She named one of my really good friends, the questioner, actually. She was named as a safe person. A volunteer within the preschool co-op was named a safe person. I think my mother, so her grandmother, was named a safe person. So have that network of 3 to 4 people, because sometimes it's nice to have that third parent, if you will, to have that open relationship with them. And sometimes it makes it a little bit easier to have that conversation. All right. No other questions, huh, Sundus? Okay.
You were so clear, mashallah.
Oh, good. Wow. That okay. Alhamdulillah. I'm so excited that we were able to get through it in a semi-timely fashion. And inshallah, it was clear.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you so much to both of our presenters, Noreen and Chaplain Sundus. Thank you very much for giving us and gracing us with your time and your knowledge. God bless you and your families, inshallah. For all of our attendees, thank you so much. May God also bless each and every one of you. And may God protect you, your family, those who you love, and our entire community, inshallah. Again, thank you for joining us for this very important conversation. Jazakallahu khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.